Hi, welcome to Fit Kids Conversations. I'm here with Matt Levy, cardiologist, and we're going to be talking a lot about the heart's role in fitness as we do in all of these Fit Kids conversations, applying all manner of expertise to youth fitness for your benefit. Matt, welcome. And if you will, please start off by talking a little bit about the work that you do and how it applies to children.
Well, thanks for having me here. It's an honor and fun for me to be here in this format. So I'm a cardiologist, and I actually have a specialty area in cardiology that I've been doing for, at this point, 16 years. It's called electrophysiology, and it's primarily involving the electrical system of the heart. So, you know, the heart is actually a fantastic and interesting organ. It involves a lot of physiology, but the electrical system of the heart is what kind of keeps the timing just right. And as you probably know, the pediatric world and the adult world diverge very early. There are pediatric cardiologists, and then there, believe it or not, pediatric electrophysiologists who work on the electrical system of the heart in children. But one of the unique things about my field is I'm actually one of the few cardiologists at my hospital that's credentialed to work with adolescents. So down to 12, 13 years old is the youngest I will work with. That's usually somewhere the transition between pediatrics and adolescent cardiology is in that zone, because young people, believe it or not, get abnormal heart rhythms. And children, teenagers, young adults will describe feeling like their heart racing. Rarely they can have more dangerous things where they pass out, or sadly can even pass away from such an arrhythmia. So that's the kind of cardiology that I'm involved with. That's kind of generally how I interface with the younger adults and adolescents. And it can be a challenging career because sometimes, as I just mentioned, these things are very heavy.
Sure. So in current times, we're looking at the situation with Damar Hamlin from the Buffalo Bills, who had a tragic event on the field, and we're still waiting at this point to see how that shapes up. Signs point to him moving in the right directions.
Yep.
In today's news. Can you talk a little bit about what the condition was, as far as you know it?
Sure.
And is there a way to detect that at an early age and prevent what occurred to Damar Hamlin?
Yeah, well, what happened to Damar Hamlin, it sounds like, well, let me back up for a moment. So we call this sudden death. It's kind of a strange term because, he didn't pass away, but sudden death is kind of defined as, typically a ventricular arrhythmia that results in lack of cardiac function and subsequent death. Usually with younger people, it has to do with being born with some kind of genetic abnormality in terms of your heart's electrical system. Because if you have other forms of congenital heart disease, you're born with some kind of defect. For example, tetralogy of Fallot. Things are very abnormal from the moment you're born. There's clearly a problem from the moment you're born. You might be born and be blue and have low oxygen levels. So these things are picked up literally, in the first couple moments of life. But arrhythmia issues are not, because your heart is structurally normal. So there's no problems with your heart structure. And for all appearances, you're a normal, healthy kid. In this country, probably the most common one is something called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is something that you're born with where your heart is very thick, abnormally thick. And when you hear about kind of high profile athletes, Hank Gathers and people like that passing away during the basketball game, It's frequently hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And there's a variety of these genetic disorders. There's a disorder called long QT syndrome. There's a disorder called Brugada syndrome. So these are things that we're aware of and we're looking for. What's really unique about this event with this young Buffalo Bills football player is this occurred immediately after a significant contact. And if you watch the play, he took a helmet directly to the chest during a tackle. And there's a phenomenon called comedo cordis. And what comedo cordis is that, believe it or not, a strong enough impact to the chest can actually cause a bruise and fibrillate the heart. This is more commonly seen. I mean, this is incredibly rare. It's not something that, this is just an accident. This is just trauma. It's just so unusual that it happens in just the right location. The cases that I've read and seen involve baseball players, so a baseball player will get struck in the chest by a ball. And of course, baseball players are not wearing the same kind of protective shielding that a football player is wearing. And so these things have been documented more commonly in baseball. But I don't think I've ever seen an event like this at football, in a football game. And there's really no way sadly, to kind of, pick up, someone who may be prone to such an event, because it's really not a genetic problem or a structural problem at all. It's just bad luck and trauma. What I anticipate might happen is that the NFL may kind of rethink kind of some of the protective padding in front of the chest. A death during a football game is a super rare event, but still, it may be enough for them to kind of change the padding, maybe a stronger padding in the front side of the chest to protect from such an event.
Got it. So what I surmise out of all that you said, and that was incredible insight and great summary for us to understand this
Sure.
injury. Even if this child is seen at early age to have a heart condition, that would not necessarily preclude that child from athletic activities or limit them in certain ways. If I've got that right, I would love to have that confirmation. I'm sure parents out there would as well. But if I've got it wrong, please reframe.
Yeah. So generally with kids, it's most of the stuff is picked up when they're infants. So these are, and by the way, congenital heart disease has, there was a day where if you were born with a congenital heart condition, you either didn't survive at all or you survived for maybe 20 years. Now I'm the whole field of adult congenital cardiology has become a field because so many of these kids are living fairly long lives. Now, obviously it's not easy. They require multiple surgeries and they have multiple different unique types of electrical problems. So this is something a parent would know probably at this point in utero. Like they would know their child has some kind of problem. And if not in utero, they would know immediately once their child is born. These other things are a little scarier in a way that because no one knows, a few years ago here in Los Gatos, there was a young kid who collapsed at a football game. He played for Los Gatos High School, and he died of sudden death right there on the field. It was a shock for the community. And there's lots of reports of things like this happening. There's still incredibly rare events. And there has been conversation about having some kind of screening process nationally for high school students. The problem with it is kind of hard to pick up some of these problems. Professional athletes and collegiate athletes absolutely have screening, and it's still missed. A lot of the high profile athletes that have passed away, either collegiate or professional. These are people that got through the whole system, and nothing was ever picked up. So, what I would say, and there are countries that do screening for every high school athlete. It is not an easy thing to do in the United States of America because of our population. But I mean, an EKG, having a doctor put a stethoscope on a child's chest, referring that child to a cardiologist if there's any abnormality, I think would be the way to start. And these are very simple, non-invasive ways of trying to pick up a problem. After this event at Los Gatos High School, a group of parents kind of enlisted my services, and we created a screening for all of the high school athletes at Los Gatos High School. And I've actually since that time participated in a bunch of other screening programs around the region. Honestly, they're very low yield. And to date, we've never picked up someone, thankfully, that had a problem. But I do think it gives people a certain level of comfort. You're really trying to find a needle in a haystack. But, it is possible that if programs like this were widespread, we could pick up some of these kids. The other thing I'd say to parents is that if your child is complaining of a racing heart, something that you shouldn't blow off, because children don't know. But I've met young adults that tell me they were playing high school volleyball, and all of a sudden their heart would race, and they just thought that was normal because they didn't have the kind of perspective that we have as adults. So if your child complains of skipping, palpitations, heart racing, that's something that I would, doesn't mean something terrible is wrong, but I would also recommend that child see a cardiologist. Sometimes we'll do a monitor to try to get a sense of what's going on, another non-invasive test. And then the obvious ones are things like feigning. Feigning is kind of a normal thing, believe it or not. I don't know if you've ever fainted, but I've fainted before. Feigning feels awful, but there are different types of feigning. Sometimes you can see blood for the first time and faint. That's kind of a fairly common reason to faint, and we could talk about the physiology behind that. But then there's kids that are just sitting at the dinner table and and faint, and they wake up. And because fainting is kind of a common thing that happens to people, these people never seek medical attention. And on rare occasions, fainting is an indication that there could be an electrical problem with the heart.
Amazing. There's so much knowledge, and I think that'll be really helpful and frankly reassuring, again, in light of Damar Hamlin.
Sure.
And I mean, it's actually a lot of great news.
Okay.
Such a sad event.
Yeah.
To switch topic a little bit and just talk about general heart health,
Sure.
especially in children. And I know your expertise, you said, or practice only goes down to ages 12 or 13. Start working with kids usually 4 or 5.
Sure.
So is there things that can be done? I mean, obviously activity helps and about that, but certain types of activities and are HIIT workouts, for example, more likely to produce long-term heart health in kids than, say, slow and steady? Or is it just like any movement is good movement? What's your take on that?
That's an interesting question. I mean, again, I'll preface this with that, look, I'm not an expert in exercise physiology, and obviously I'm not a pediatric cardiologist, but I'm not aware of any data that specific or certain type of exercise is better or worse for kids. I think the principles really are kind of moving the body, and people who are athletes or people who have built some kind of athletic activity into their life, a lot of it starts as a kid. A lot of those people you know, and it's not, you don't have to necessarily have access to, you know, an ice skating rink or golf equipment to be active. Um, you know, I mean, obviously running really pretty much only requires a pair of shoes. So I think it's important that the children get used to being active, and there's obviously the social element as well, like being active with other young people. I think for kids is fun. Their bodies like to move, and I think if you build something like that into a kid's life, um, it becomes ingrained in a much deeper way. So I think any kind of movement is important. I would say that at a child's age, cardio isn't probably more important. I would say strength training is clearly not important as a child. Um, just the movement and the joy of movement, I think, is good for our brains. And I think it gets kids used to being active, and it gets kids socializing with other kids. And I think it is incredibly important. Um, the other thing is diet, because I think that, and diet sometimes is a challenge because sometimes eating well is either not easy and sometimes can be expensive. Um, but I don't know about you, but I grew up with a lot of kids where fast food that was just part of life, and fast food was part of my life when I was growing up too. But too much fast food and too much simple sugars can be, I think, again, I'm speaking about things that are fairly obvious, but can be detrimental to children's health. And I think in the United States, I think we have more obese children than any country in the world. And the myriad of problems that comes from childhood obesity, I think, is well documented. I mean, it's hard to move when you're obese, and these youngsters develop, mechanical problems, orthopedic problems, health problems at a younger age. They also can't participate in some of these activities we were just talking about. And then they miss out on some of the social aspects and the self-esteem issues. So I think diet is a really important piece of this puzzle with children that sometimes is overlooked.
Yeah, great points. And one of the Fit Kids focuses primarily on underserved youth. So these are kids who oftentimes live in so-called food deserts,
Sure.
Access to fresh produce and the like.
Yep.
And don't have the same opportunities in terms of safe outdoor play spaces and the like. So
Right.
what are some things that you feel we could do or impart to people from those communities who may be watching this about what measures can they take even in these constrained circumstances?
I mean, I think, just like adults, um, exercise, if it can be a social event, changes the dynamic entirely. Like if I'm going to go to the gym with a buddy, I'm much more likely to attend. Or if I'm part of a local sports team, a pickup basketball league, I'm much more likely to attend than if I'm just on my own. So I think kind of creating a community around a variety of different options for kids, and that can be, martial arts, that can be basketball, that can be running club. But these clubs, create an environment where it's fun, they develop friendships, and oh, by the way, this activity is oriented around moving your body. And I mean, I think that's the key with kids. we're so attached to our phones and movies and television, and I don't think that's going to be something that's so easy to change. But if you can kind of hammer out, 30 minutes in a day, 45 minutes in a day where your child can interact with some other children, I think the benefits are through the roof. And I think those kind of things, I think those kinds of activities really are available. I think they're out there already. And I've known people that have created their own activities for their own local communities, like, well, we don't want to, someone's home taking care of the kid and, driving across town or driving somewhere else isn't palatable. Well, I know people that have created local clubs just with the children and parents on their block. I don't think you need 20 kids to have a club. You could have 5 kids in a running club, and kids, kids, if they're hanging out with their friends and parents are kind of running the show, it can happen. So I think those things are, those kinds of opportunities are low-hanging fruit. In terms of diet's a little tougher, because, parents are busy, parents have financial constraints. It's not as easy of a thing to address, although I do think there's more out there now these days about the importance of healthy, healthy eating than there was when I was a kid, for sure. One of the things I've always kind of been interested in is, I remember living in San Francisco, and we would go to like a Whole Foods to buy some fresh produce, and bananas, vegetables would cost a certain amount of money, and then I would drive 2 miles or walk to Chinatown or some other parts of the city, and the same produce was a fraction of the cost. I never really kind of understood the economics of that and how that was able to be. But I don't think can't be, it must be possible to recreate a similar kind of phenomenon in different parts of the country. I'm just, at this point, I'm musing out loud because I always thought, well, gosh, like I can go buy some peppers for half the price. Like, why isn't everyone just driving to Chinatown? But they don't. So I've wondered about those kinds of things. I know there's some communities, there's, local, little patches of, like, what are they called? Like little mini farms in some communities. I see a lot of that when I go visit my daughter in Seattle. There'll be these collective farms where you have a little parcel and you can kind of grow your own vegetables. That takes a certain amount of motivation. I'm not sure that I could have done that. That being said, my stepdad, when I was a kid, we had a little garden in our little tiny yard, and right outside of Washington, D.C. So I think it's possible. It does require a little extra work, but I think sometimes that's also something that kids can really enjoy. I have some fond memories of hanging out with my stepdad and working in our little tiny garden, and we would get peppers and string beans, cucumbers. So I think something like that is possible, but realistically, are people going to do that? Probably not, but I guess it's an option. I think kind of locally sourced, locally grown food has a greater potential to be not so expensive. And I don't know if we can get some of these kind of programs into different parts of the city. Maybe that's an area that could be explored.
Sure. Yeah, there are local gardens, community gardens, urban gardens, so to speak, and urban farmers. And all of what you're talking about here is really central to an idea of people in underserved communities taking matters into their own hands as much as to ensure their own health. And hopefully, fit kids, not that we're farmers or gardeners, but can be part of that really homegrown community oriented approach to fitness, and the recognition that, it doesn't really pay to wait and rely on the government or, some other savior. So that's all great food for thought, pardon the pun. And hopefully fit kids and can bring activity into that realm as well.
Sure.
With folks who are doing that. So I also wanted to talk about the kind of attacks on obesity in underserved communities. So some of what we've been talking about, but specifically applied to the disproportionate amount of obesity in underserved communities. And maybe we've exhausted ideas, but if you have any more about how to attack that ill, I would love to hear about it.
There is a certain percentage of these kids where there is a genetic basis for it. I mean, we didn't talk about that, but I've met parents who have asked me similar questions, like, my kid's out there in the playground with these other kids, and our diet is kind of fairly normal. Why is my child so much heavier than other children? And there are some genetics around those kinds of issues. So I would, if your kid, if you feel like your kid is obese at a young age, I wouldn't kind of just assume there's nothing else going on, from a medical standpoint. And it probably should be just, at least asked of the pediatrician, hey, this is something I've noticed. I mean, there's a variety of disorders, and it's obviously unusual for kids to have like diabetes. A lot of times kids that have diabetes are actually super thin. But there are other disorders that can cause obesity in children that probably should be explored. Again, those are kind of, I think, much more unusual, but I would be amiss if I didn't say those things should be explored as well. In terms of just the generally fighting obesity, I do think, education is always important. Parents sometimes tend to grouse when they're being told that they're doing something wrong, or could be doing something better, especially when it comes to their children. People can get defensive and upset. But I mean, I think a lot of this also has to do with parents, and parents that are motivated to try to mix it up. And if this information, some of this diet stuff is not, it doesn't always have to be costly. Some of it is just kind of basics. For example, soft drinks. Soft drinks are just so pervasive, and I'm not saying a child can't have a Sprite or a Coca-Cola, but you open up a refrigerator in some people's homes, and it's just a lot of sugar. And those are simple steps that can be taken. You go through your pantry, how much in there is just, when your child wants a snack, are they grabbing sugar cereal to snack on, or, is there something else that we could substitute that might be equally healthy? So there are things that I think parents can learn if they're willing. And I think there's a combination of the parents being kind of open-minded to it, and also how it's presented. If it's presented in a way that, hey, you're doing this wrong, and you're not a good parent, I think you tend to offend. But I think if you present it in a way that, hey, have you considered doing this? This is what I do. I think, and my kid loves it, and now all he wants is apples and honey, or whatever that your example is. So I think there are ways of communicating this to adults that are more palatable. Again, no pun intended. And I think that could really make, again, and I think parents care, and parents want to be better parents. And so I think some kind of community outreach in terms of healthy eating for parents probably is the most important thing, because kids aren't in control of what they're eating really at that age.
Well, it's been really helpful. Got just a couple minutes left, and
Sure.
I want to, make sure that we have an opportunity to say a proper thank you and goodbye before we stop our conversation. But if you have any, maybe 1 minute biteable, condensed ideas that are going to move individuals and our nation as a whole toward heart healthiness, let's hear those.
Sure. I mean, the simplest things, and I tell my adult patients this: if you don't move it, you're going to lose it. You start to get older, you take for granted the fact that you can run. You take for granted balance, and you take these things for granted. And for people as they get older, if they're not active and they're not moving, they lose function. And without being overly dramatic, honestly, it's the same thing for kids. So move it or lose it. It doesn't matter what you're doing or how you're doing it. Just make sure that you can, make sure that you're active at least, 30 minutes a day. Make it fun. If it's fun, it'll get done. And then in terms of diet, do the simple things first. Cut out all the simple sugars. Cut out the soft drinks. You will be surprised at how much that contributes to your overall fitness with just a simple change in what you're putting into your body.
Fantastic. Matt, thanks so much for your time and expertise here. Fit Kids really appreciates it, and we'll look forward to hearing more from you soon.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.